I want to begin with a story from John Ortberg's book. It's called The Life You've Always Wanted. He has a story in there about a member of a church that he used to pastor, and he calls him Hank. And he says Hank was pretty much a grumpy guy in an ocean of happiness. Hank always had a way of finding islands of bad news. While other people saw the silver lining, Hank always saw the cloud. He was kind of a curmudgeon. He was cranky, and he was constantly complaining at the church about different things. One time, a deacon in the church asked him, said, "Hank, are you happy?" Hank paused for like 60 seconds. "Yeah," he finally answered. The deacon said, "Well, why don't you let your face know that?" And Hank, like I said, tended to complain. He went through a period where he complained about the volume of the music at the church. And so he'd complain to everybody. And eventually he started complaining to first-time visitors. A few of the board members of the church pulled him aside one day, said, "You know, Hank, you want to like complain to somebody, complain to your intimate friends, but do not complain to first-time guests and everybody that you come in contact with at the church." They thought it was over and done with. Now, sometimes Hank's unjoyfulness led to some joy in others. There was a time where, shortly after the complaining about the sound incident, that John got a call from his secretary and said, "Hey, there's somebody from OSHA here." It's like, "OSHA?" And so he goes out and he invites him into his office, and he said, "You know, I don't know that any staff members called. I don't know, we don't have anything going on here." I said, "Well, it doesn't have to be staff. Anybody in your organization can call, and I want to talk to you about the decibel levels of rock concerts and airplanes and chainsaws." And it's like, "What?" And finally it clicked. Hank had, called OSHA. The agent was all kind of fumbling over himself, said, "I'm getting a lot of ridicule at church that I'm a federal agent being sent to bust a church." And so they talked. By now, the whole staff had gathered, like, "What are we being busted for?" And so anyway, there was a little bit of joy, and that was a story that was told for years on end about how they got busted by OSHA for loud music at their church. Now, Hank, unfortunately, he didn't have very many friends. He was distant to his wife. He was distant to his kids. His son had a wonderful story about how he met his wife at a dance and how they got to know each other. He never told his dad this kind of cool story because his dad hated dancing and knew he'd make fun of him. Um, Hank, was in the church decade after decade after decade after decade. He was a young and cranky man when he entered the church. He was old and cranky by the time he died. Nothing changed. Year after year after year. And the amazing thing is, like, nobody called, like, denominational leaders. Nobody called church consultants and said, "Hey, how could somebody be in the life of our church for like 5 or 6 or 7 decades and never change, never get transformed? Like, this should have been like an emergency situation that somebody could actually claim to be a follower of Jesus Christ and be in a church and yet never go transformed, never have their life changed." In fact, the longer that Hank lived, the smaller his soul got. Do you know any Hanks? Nobody point to anybody around you. That would be rude. Do you know any Hanks? Are you a Hank? There's some areas in your life that just remain unchanged, or have you just gone through the motions in church world year after year after year? Here's the deal, when they do surveys, something like 25 to 30% of Americans claim to be born again, committed followers of Jesus. That's like 80 to 84 million people. And if you look at society, just take an hour and, watch the news or watch TV or watch the stuff that's being promoted to us. It's being promoted to us because we ingest it, we watch it. It's hard to believe that like 25 to 30% of us are being transformed by Jesus. If you look at our conversations, if you look at our conversations at work, or if you look at our social media posts, are we all that different? Are we transformed? One author put it this way. He said, if 25% of the American population says they're committed to Jesus, think about this. How much would a pound of ground beef be transformed by a quarter pound of salt being mixed into it? Be pretty transformed, right? So if Jesus says we're the salt of the earth. Where's the saltiness gone? Now, for some of us, we're nice people. We're nicer than Hank. And so we think, well, I'm nice. I'm a good, decent person. And yet niceness isn't just the goal either of this whole thing. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity says this. He says, niceness, wholesome, integrated personality is an excellent thing. We must try by every medical, educational, economic, and political means in our power to produce a world where as many people as possible grow up nice, just as we must try to produce a world where all have plenty to eat. But we must not suppose that even if we succeeded in making everyone nice, we should have saved their souls. A world of nice people, content in their own niceness, looking no further, turned away from God, would be just as desperately in need of salvation as a miserable world, and might even be more difficult to save. For mere improvement is not redemption. Though redemption always improves people, even here and now, and will in the end improve them to a degree we cannot yet imagine. God became man to turn creatures into sons, not simply to produce better men of an old kind, but to produce a new kind of man. It is not like teaching a horse to jump better and better, but like turning a horse into a winged creature. Of course, once it got its wings, it will soar over fences which could never have been jumped, and thus beat the natural horse at its own game. So the goal isn't just niceness. The goal isn't just to be a better kind of human, self-improvement. The goal is to be a completely new kind of human. Like the goal isn't just to get people to pray a sinner's prayer and go to heaven when they die and still live like hell the rest of their life. That's not the great news of Jesus. The great news of Jesus is that your and I's life can have the kingdom of God come and rule and reign over us, and we can be transformed into completely different kinds of people. People who naturally turn the other cheek. People who naturally don't always have to get their own way. People who aren't consumed by lust or anger. People who stay committed to their commitments and to their vows. People who let their yes be yes and their no be no. And a host of other things that Jesus would say in the Sermon on the Mount is what it looks like to be a transformed people in relationship with Jesus. We started that way. We're kind of like Michelangelo's great work of art, the statue called Pieta. I'm probably not pronouncing that right because I'm not Italian. But in the 70s, a radical nationalist ran up during a public display of the statue of Mary holding Jesus after his crucifixion. And that's on the lower right-hand corner. He took a sledgehammer to Mary and knocked her head off and knocked her arms off. And they have tried to put her back together, and from a distance you can see, yes, she's put back together, but if you go up close you can tell that she's been broken. We're not unlike that. We were made in the image of God, and yet we have been stained and marred by sin to a profound degree, and all of us have a need for transformation. Our Maker looks at us. The psalmist would say this. Let's take a look at that passage. The psalmist would say, the Lord looks down from heaven on humankind to see if there are any who are wise, who seek after God. They have all gone astray. They are all alike perverse. There is no one who does good. No, not one. The reality is that you and I have been broken and marred, and we are in desperate need of transformation. Today I want to talk about, as we start a series called Transformed to Transform, I want to talk about our need for transformation and even take the first step of transformation together, and we'll talk through that today. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to John chapter 2, and we'll eventually get there, but I need to set this up a little bit. You know, we spent the last 3 weeks talking about our vision. That's kind of the why. That's kind of the preferred future out on the horizon that we may or may not ever get to. It's because it's kind of a big goal. And our vision is we want to be an attractional church that creates missional people. We want our gatherings, whether our gatherings are this gathering on Sundays or our small group gatherings or Wednesday night gatherings, we want the gatherings of the church to be attractional, that people would want to be a part of this, that they would see it and they'd say, yes, this is what I want. This is I'm attracted to that. I'm drawn to that. I'm drawn to the people. I'm ultimately drawn towards God. But as we're drawn towards God, we would be missional. We would be created into people who go and change our world. We're sent to share the gospel, to do the things that Jesus did. That's our vision. Our mission is kind of the what. It's what we're going to do to get there. And our mission is to be a transforming people who transform our city together in Christ. That our mission is we want to be in a constant state of transformation ourselves. We want to invite others into that transformational relationship with Jesus and help them be transformed. And our goal is, as we do that, our friendships, our relationships, our families, our neighborhoods, eventually our city is transformed also. We're going to spend the next few weeks talking about that. Now, we're going to talk about the need of transformation, and once we recognize a need of transformation, whether we're a cranky Hank or whether we're just a nice but stuck Michelle, wherever we're at, we want to talk about the need and then maybe the first step to take on our journey of transformation. And we're going to continue to look at John throughout this series. We started that a couple weeks ago. We're going to continue to look at John, and this story that we're going to take a look at today happens just a few days, actually 3 days, after the story we read last week when Jesus called some disciples. And so Jesus and his disciples are invited to a Jewish wedding. And to understand the story, you need to understand how Jewish weddings worked. You would get into a serious engagement called you'd be betrothed. And what that would mean is you and your fiancé, you'd be committed. And the only thing that could separate you is if one of you died or if you decided to get a divorce. That's how serious their engagement period was. During that engagement period, the groom would prepare either an addition onto his parents' house or build a separate house. He would begin to get things ready for the ceremony. And then usually sometimes by surprise, this should cause some of you women to shriek in horror. By surprise, sometimes you wouldn't even know when the wedding date was. Sometimes he would just show up surprise, usually at night because they wanted to make a spectacle of it. So he'd carry torches, and he'd have all his friends. They'd come to your parents' house, and they would whisk you away to the wedding ceremony. Now, the ceremony took place that day, that night, but the reception was usually about 7 days. So you thought your reception cost some money? And in their society, being hospitable and reciprocal, being reciprocity was a real big deal. Like if I was welcoming to you, then you needed to be welcoming to me. And if I had you over for dinner, then you were obligated to have me over for dinner. That was a big deal in their culture. And it really was a big deal in weddings. And so you had to have a certain level of reception, a certain level of food and drink. And if you didn't have a certain level, if you didn't provide your guests with a certain level, then they could take the guests could take up to half of your gifts home with them. And if you really did something bad at the wedding or the reception, then you were liable and they could sue you. You thought you were trying to get the cake right at your wedding, man. I mean, this was, high-level stuff. This is the situation and the kind of wedding that Jesus enters into. Take a look and let's talk about some transformation. John 2, on the third day, we're at the first verse. On the third day, that means the third day after the stories we've read the last few weeks of Jesus calling his disciples. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." So, this is one of those major social faux pas in the community, that they have ran out of wine. This would be not just the guests get to take half of the gifts home with them. This is lawsuit material in their culture. Not to mention, this young couple would kind of have a stained reputation, and their parents would too, for the rest of their life in that little village. They didn't do the honorable thing. They didn't provide enough for their guests, which was huge in that culture. And Mary, there's some belief that maybe Mary, Jesus' mother, was maybe one of the hosts or hostesses or helped prepare. So maybe she was the caterer or whatever. But she goes to Jesus. She knows enough about her son to say, "Hey, we've ran out. We don't have any more. The wine's all gone." And again, this isn't a shrug moment like it would be at your wedding. Well, we still got punch, I mean, this was a major deal in their culture. Like I said, lawsuits, putting the young couple behind the 8 ball financially right off the bat, not to mention their standing within the community. So what do? I just want to pause here and say, if you want to be transformed, at the very least, you need to recognize you have a need of transformation. Whether you're just flat out empty, like the wine containers were, if you just recognize, man, I'm void of substance in my life, I'm empty, I'm lonely, or whether your life's just plain and as ordinary as water, and you're going, I recognize that I am not experiencing the abundant life that Jesus promised. Like I go to church, I go to group, okay. But abundant life, when Jesus says things later in John, like living water will just flow out of his followers and will refresh them and refresh everybody around them, and you take an assessment of your life, that's not really like me. Or whether it's not just that you're plain and ordinary, maybe it's that you know some dark areas in your life. You know some sinful things that you are harboring. You know some things that if they were exposed to everybody right now, you'd be deeply embarrassed. And yet you've tried to transform, and no matter how hard you try, you just don't get any traction. The first step in transformation is just recognizing your need for transformation. Let me encourage you, all of us, to take some time, whether that's first thing in the morning, but probably for most of us, it might be when we lay down at night and doing the inventory with God. Pray a prayer like David prayed in Psalm 139. Take a look at 139, verses 23 and 24. Search me, God, know my heart. Test me, it means evaluate me, and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. If you want to be transformed, the first thing you have to do is recognize that you have a need for transformation. And the easiest way to find out that you have a need of transformation is just ask God. It's one of the old lines in our church. When somebody says, I can't hear God's voice, how do you hear God's voice? Start with this prayer. God, what's wrong with me? I bet you'll hear his voice. It's pretty easy. You'll have whole paragraphs like, oh, yeah, there's that, and there's that. Oh, yeah, I called my sister that, and yeah, I did that, and yeah. You just start, so just ask him, search me, oh God, show me my need for transformation. Now let's take a look at the situation, how it turned out after Jesus is told about it. Let's go to the next verse there in John. Woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my hour has not yet come. Now, granted, this sounds a little harsh towards his mom. In Jesus' culture, the word woman there was more like madam or my lady, but still, that's not a term of affection. I don't go around calling my mom, madam or my lady or something, she would even be offended by that, But what Jesus seems to be doing here is he's saying our relationship is different now. My ministry has begun. And you're no longer my, mom who can kind of direct my life in Jewish culture. I've become my own person, and I have a different thing than my family. I have a different mission than my family. And in John, when he says, my hour is not yet come, almost always when that phrase, he's always, the kind of practical, physical, tangible thing that we know he calls my hour, it's his crucifixion. He says, it's not my time yet, don't direct me on this. But I love what Mary does. Take a look at the next passage. Mary doesn't take no, for some of you have mothers like that don't take no for an answer. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used for Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Mary says, hey, Jesus, we're out of wine. He goes, it's not my hour. Why are you bothering me with this? And I love it because she just looks at the servant and says, he'll take care of it. Just do what he says. So they find these jars of water and that used to hold water, and they end up filling them, it says, to the brim. Now here's the deal. These are stone water jars. Not sure how heavy they were, but think of stone jars that could handle 20 to 30 gallons of water. Water weighs, I think a gallon of water is something like 8.34 pounds. So 20 gallons is 160 pounds plus the stone jars. 30 gallons, is like almost 250 pounds plus the stone jars. Let's just keep it easy and we'll say they're 25 gallons each. It's about 200 pounds of water plus the jars. And Jesus says, go ahead and do that. Go ahead and fill those things up with water. Now we'll come back to this in a second, but just put your head around this. So I've just given you an application of Psalm 139. The first step is the need for transformation. And you might be like these servants going, wait a second, like, what do I do? I'm just supposed to pray out of Psalm 139. I'm supposed to ask God to search my heart and show me the need for transformation. What's that going to do? I kind of got to believe these servants are the same way, that they're going, Jesus, I don't know if you heard, but we didn't run out of water. We ran out of wine, and you want us to fill this up? And how much wine do we need? It's like 1,200 gallons of wine. What are we doing, The deal is, when you want to start the road to transformation, you just have to be willing to do it over and over and over again, to keep doing whatever Jesus said to do. That's what Mary told the servants. Just do what he said. And look what they did. Let's take a look at verse 8 here. 8 through 11. Then he told them, now draw out some water, take it to the master of the banquet. So they did, and the master of the banquet tested the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, meaning the highest alcohol content. You bring that out first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you've saved the best until now. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. What's the point of this passage? Why have this miracle? I got a birthday card a few years ago from somebody in the church, and we'll show the outside cover here first. So take a look at this birthday card. Reverend, have you been drinking? Just water, officer. And then the inside of the card says this. Then why do I smell wine? Good Lord, he's done it again. I don't think that's the point of this. I don't think the point is to go home and, golly, I got a 24-pack of bottled water. Wouldn't it be great to have wine? Let's just pray and see. That is literally what happened. Jesus did a transformative work in that moment. Think about that. H2O somehow had carbon molecules added to it because there's sugar in wine. Not to mention tartaric and citric acid and malic. There's all these different components. Tannins, all of it is in there. St. Augustine, commenting on this passage, said, this miracle happens every year. It just takes a lot longer for H2O to fall from the clouds, to become moisture in a grape, to be fermented, and that Jesus just sped that whole thing up in an instant. So what's the point? Yes, he took care of a real need. He helped a young couple out. Get all that. That's part of the story, and that is true. But, it's got to be something deeper than just you and I going around praying at the water fountain out here hoping wine comes out, right? Just the end of the story is the key, where John, who later in his gospel says there's thousands of miracles, you would fill up every book in the whole world if I wrote down everything Jesus did. So why does he include this one? He only includes 7 miracles in his gospel. Why this one? He says it is a sign. The word sign in the gospel just means what it says. It points to something. So what is it pointing to? It's pointing to this. Jesus is able to incredibly transform your life and my life. Jesus has the power. If he can take H2O in an instant, turn it into wine with all those components, he is able to take whatever's going on or not going on in your heart that should be, He's able to take that and transform your life. How does that take place? First, you recognize the need. You pray, Psalm 139, search me, O God, show me. But then you listen. And whatever Jesus tells you to do, you do it over, over, over again. Put yourself in the story. You're the servants. You know the wine's run out. You know it's going to be a bad day around there. The master of the house and the governor of the ceremony, the master of the ceremony, they're all going to be very upset. And Mary just says, hey, you guys, you just do whatever he says. And Jesus says, I want you to fill up 250 gallons worth of these jars. Fill it up with water. How do you do that in the ancient world? Turn on the faucet? Grab the garden hose? Most likely, for short transportation, they would have used 2-gallon animal skins. So think about that. You go into either the stream or the town well, filling up your 2 gallons of animal skins. Oh, is this going to work? Why am I getting water? We need wine. You think it'd be okay if we just filled it up halfway? What if, do we have to go all the way to the top? I love it that John says they filled it up to the brim. They did it over and over and over and over again. You put it all together, and I think the point of this passage is simply this. The amount of wine you'll end up having in your life is the amount of water you'll bring to Jesus. Are you willing to bring every part of your life, every part of your heart to Jesus over and over and over again? The amount of wine you'll have in your life is in direct proportion to how much water you will bring to Jesus. Maybe you're struggling with trusting Jesus. Search me, O God. I'm struggling in trusting you. And he begins to ask you to make decisions. What do? You just make those decisions over and over and over again. You're struggling to trust on your finances, and he convicts you to start tithing. What do? You just do that over and over and over again. He's asked, you realize that you've got some greedy parts in your heart, and he says, I want you to be generous towards this missionary. I want you to sell this beloved item and give it away. I mean, whatever he begins to tell you, you do it over and over and over again. You're struggling with anxiety, and you say, search me, O God, reveal my anxious thought. Oh yeah, I have all this anxiety, have all these areas I'm holding in on myself and trusting myself instead of trusting you, and I'm worried. And he says, I want you to meditate on Psalm 23, 15 minutes every day. What's that going to do? I don't need meditation. I need peace. I don't need, just to memorize a scripture or to meditate on it. And how does this equal that? I don't know. I don't know how water equals wine, but somehow he involves us in the process. I mean, if the guy can transform water into wine, he could have just said, there's 6 empty stone jars. Lord, fill them up. It could have filled with wine. But somehow, and some reason, he includes us in the transformation. And whatever he tells you to do, you keep bringing water over and over again. If it's in little 2-gallon animal skins, over and over again, you fill it to the brim, and then you trust him to transform you. Whatever he tells you to do, you just keep doing it. Keep doing it. Keep doing it. Because the amount of wine you end up with is in direct proportion with the amount of water you bring to it. Whatever's ordinary, unchanged, even dark, you bring it to him over and over again. And the promise of Jesus is, I will transform you. I will transform your life. Follow me and I will transform you. Over and over. He takes watery people and he makes them into wine. He takes people that have drank sludge their whole life and he gives them something that's vintage and of value. The amount of wine you'll end up with is in direct proportion with the amount of water you bring. Now this, and we'll tease this out over the next few weeks, this isn't just for you. That would be an end of itself to some degree because you're going to bring glory to God as you're transformed. But it isn't just for you. Transformation always leaks out to those around us and has a profound impact. Think about that. That wine just wasn't for just the immediate people that saw the miracle. It wasn't just for the servants, but as they saw it transformed a whole wedding. And with 1,200 gallons, most scholars believe Jesus was going above and beyond because that became kind of the nest egg and the gift to this couple. This young couple now had something of value and worth that they either had for years and years and years or they were able to sell. I mean, hey, you put that on eBay. Wine Jesus created. I mean, that goes for a high dollar, you know. And so the transformation just wasn't for the immediate people. That transformation went to the whole group and the whole family and the whole village. Because we're transformed to transform. But today, it's best just to remember this. The amount of wine you'll end up with is in direct proportion with the amount of water you bring to Jesus. Let's just see what Jesus would have for us.